The cold Chicago air bit at Alara's skin as she stepped into the alley behind La Stella d'Oro, the scent of truffle oil and stale champagne clinging to her uniform. It was the only moment of quiet she got, a brief exhale between the gilded cage of the dining room and the long bus ride home. But the silence was shattered by the scrape of leather on pavement. Before she could turn, a rough hand clamped over her mouth, another grabbing her waist, lifting her off her feet with brutal efficiency. A wave of sheer terror washed over her, cold and paralyzing. The metallic tang of fear filled her throat as she was dragged toward a gleaming black sedan, idling in the shadows, its engine a low, predatory growl. She was thrown into the back seat, the door slamming shut with a sound of absolute finality, plunging her into a suffocating darkness. Her world shattered in an instant, a victim of a mistake that would cost someone their life. But who, and why her? Watch until the end to discover the truth that connects a simple waitress to the city's most feared man. Subscribe now and tell us in the comments where you're watching from as this story unfolds. Alara Vance, at 24, had learned to make herself small, a ghost gliding between tables, laden with crystal and silver. Her life was a carefully balanced ledger of exhaustion and duty, every dollar she earned earmarked for a family debt that felt more like an ancestral curse. She moved with a quiet dignity that was entirely her own, a shield against the casual cruelties of her world. Her resilience was a silent, stubborn flame flickering in the depths of her tired eyes, a testament to an integrity she refused to pawn, even when it was the only thing of value she had left. The restaurant itself was a world of stark contrasts. In the dining room, low ambient light danced off polished marble floors, and the hushed murmurs of the city's elite wove a tapestry of power. But for Alara, reality was the relentless heat of the kitchen, the clatter of dishes, and the tight, false smile she wore like a second uniform. She served men who could buy and sell entire city blocks, yet they never truly saw her. She was part of the scenery, a functional, invisible piece of the opulent machine. The scent of expensive cologne and simmering sauces was the smell of a life she observed through a thick pane of glass, a world away from her own cramped existence, a constant reminder of her place. Her solitude was a constant companion, a heavy cloak she wore even in a crowded room. It was woven from the threads of a past loss, the memory of her father's long illness, and the mountain of medical bills that had buried her family's future. That injustice had forged her moral compass, leaving her with a sharp, unwavering sense of right and wrong that felt increasingly out of place in a city built on compromise. She watched the powerful patrons, their laughter echoing with a hollowness she could feel in her bones. Their confidence seemed brittle, their authority a performance. Her strength wasn't in defiance, but in her quiet, unwavering observation, in the way she held her spine straight even when the weight of her life threatened to crush her. The oppression was a low, constant hum beneath the surface of her days. It was in the lingering, proprietary gaze of her manager, a man whose small authority was a weapon he wielded with casual precision. It was in the gnawing anxiety that twisted in her stomach on slow nights, calculating tips and bills. The numbers, a relentless tyrant. This job was not a stepping stone. It was a cage crafted from financial necessity, and each shift felt like another bar being welded into place. The city lights glittered outside the grand windows of La Stella d'Oro, promising a world of possibility, but for her, they only illuminated the walls of her prison, a beautiful, inescapable trap. Tonight something was different. A tension crackled in the air, thick and unfamiliar. As she cleared the last table, she noticed a black sedan parked across the street, its polished exterior drinking the dim streetlight. It was the kind of car that didn't belong in this part of the city, unless it was delivering someone who owned it. She saw a flicker of movement in the alley's mouth, a silhouette that melted back into the shadows as soon as she looked. A chill, unrelated to the evening wind, traced a path down her spine. She dismissed it as fatigue, a mind worn thin from too many hours on her feet. But it was not paranoia. It was the quiet, chilling prelude to a collision of worlds. The long bus ride home was a purgatory of flickering fluorescent lights and the weary sighs of strangers. Alara rested her forehead against the cold glass, watching Chicago's glittering skyline bleed into the blurred streaks of passing traffic. Each light was a distant star, a promise of a life she could only observe. The vehicle was a vessel of the city's exhausted, carrying its passengers through the night like ghosts returning to their haunts. She felt the day's fatigue settle deep in her bones. A familiar ache that was more than physical. It was the weight of unspoken dreams and unpaid debts. A heaviness that clung to her soul long after her shift had ended. The bus groaned to a halt at her stop, releasing her back into the quiet, indifferent streets of her neighborhood. Her apartment was a small, clean box on the 4th floor of a building that had seen better decades. It was her sanctuary and her cage. The scent of old paper from her father's books mingled with the faint aroma of the lavender she kept in a small vase on the windowsill. This was where she could finally exhale, shedding the forced smiles and deferential posture of her job. She moved through the space with a familiar, quiet grace, her actions economical and precise. Every object had its place. A small island of order in a sea of financial chaos. It was a life lived in the margins, a silent testament to her resilience. But the 4 walls often felt like they were closing in, a constant, physical reminder of how little room she had to breathe. On the small kitchen table, a crisp white envelope lay waiting. It was from the bank, a monthly reminder of the debt that had anchored her life since her father's passing. The numbers inside were a relentless tide, threatening to pull her under no matter how hard she swam. It was more than just a financial burden. It was a ghost. It was the price of a few more months with him, a cost she would pay for the rest of her life without regret, but with an enduring sorrow. That piece of paper held more power over her future than any of her own desires. It dictated her hours, her exhaustion, her inability to even consider a different path. It was the invisible chain that kept her tethered to La Stella d'Oro, serving men who would never understand its weight. A soft cough from the other room drew her attention. Her mother, frail and lost in a world of faded memories, was a constant gentle pressure on her heart. Ilara's earnings kept them both afloat, paid for the medicine on the nightstand and the food in the fridge. The responsibility was a cloak she wore without complaint, a silent vow she had made to her father. Yet, it deepened her isolation. She couldn't share the true extent of her struggles, the daily cuts and bruises to her spirit, for fear of adding to her mother's own anxieties. She would simply smile, assure her that everything was fine, and carry the burden alone. This quiet, loving deception was perhaps the heaviest load of all, a sacrifice of her own truth for another's peace. Her uniform, hanging on the back of her bedroom door, was a symbol of her subjugation. The crisp white shirt and black apron were a costume she wore to become invisible, a functional part of the restaurant's opulent decor. Each night, she would hand wash it in the small sink, scrubbing away the stains of spilled wine and rich sauces, as if she could also wash away the lingering touches of her manager's gaze or the condescending tones of wealthy patrons. Putting it on the next evening felt like donning a suit of armor and a prisoner's garb all at once. It erased Ilara Vance and replaced her with a nameless waitress, a role she played with practiced perfection, hiding the fierce, tired heart that beat beneath the starched cotton. Mr. Sterling, the restaurant's manager, moved through the dining room with the predatory grace of a man who enjoyed his small kingdom. His authority was a weapon he wielded with casual cruelty, often directed at Ilara. He found a particular satisfaction in pointing out her supposed flaws in front of others, a small smile playing on his lips as he did. His compliments were always laced with a possessive undertone, his eyes lingering a moment too long on her face or hands. She navigated his presence with a carefully constructed wall of professional indifference, her responses brief and polite. But his constant low-grade harassment was an acid, slowly eating away at her composure, a daily reminder of her powerlessness in a world that saw her as an object. Even in this oppressive environment, her integrity remained her anchor. She saw a new busboy, young and terrified, drop a tray of expensive glassware. As Mr. Sterling descended upon him with a torrent of verbal abuse, Ilara quietly stepped in. She didn't challenge the manager directly. That would be professional suicide. Instead, she began efficiently cleaning the mess, her calm presence diffusing the tension. "It was an accident. I can help," she said softly, her voice steady. The manager, deprived of his audience and his momentum, grumbled and walked away. It was a small act, unnoticed by the patrons, but for Ilara, it was a reaffirmation of her own moral code. It was a silent declaration that her spirit, at least, was not for sale. Some nights, standing by the panoramic windows of La Stella d'Oro, she would allow herself to dream. She would look out at the architectural marvels of Chicago, the soaring towers of steel and glass, and remember a time when she had sketched her own designs in a worn notebook. She had wanted to build things, to create spaces that were both beautiful and functional, to leave a mark on the world that was her own. Now her hands, which once held pencils, only carried trays. The dream felt like it belonged to another person, a ghost from a past life. The city's grandeur was no longer an inspiration, but a taunt, a glittering monument to a future that had been stolen from her before it could even begin. Time itself had become her enemy. The grand clock in the dining room, with its elegant Roman numerals, seemed to mock her. During her shifts, its hands moved with agonizing slowness, each minute stretching into an eternity of balancing plates and feigning smiles. Yet, the precious hours of her own life, the time she had for rest or for herself, evaporated in an instant. The ticking was a constant metronomic reminder of the life she was spending, trading finite, irreplaceable moments for the dollars she needed to merely survive. It was the rhythm of her entrapment, a sound that echoed the frantic, tired beating of her own heart as she ran in place, day after day, never getting ahead. Tonight, the oppression became concrete. A wealthy patron, angered by a declined credit card, created a scene, falsely accusing Alara of spilling wine on his wife's designer handbag. Mr. Sterling, ever eager to placate the powerful, didn't even ask for her side of the story. He apologized profusely to the couple and informed Alara that the cost of the damage, a sum that amounted to nearly her entire week's pay, would be deducted from her wages. She stood there, frozen in a state of quiet humiliation, the injustice a bitter pill in her throat. Defeated and unseen, she retreated to the alley for a breath of air, the cold brick wall a poor substitute for the support she craved. It was in that moment of absolute vulnerability that the world she knew was torn away. The ride was a blur of darkness and speed, ending with a jolt that threw Ilara against the supple leather of the seat. The car door opened not to another alley, but to a pristine subterranean garage, the air cool and tasting of concrete and gasoline. She was pulled out, her arms held in a bruising grip, and led through silent, marble-lined corridors into a private elevator that ascended with a disorienting, silent swiftness. The door slid open to reveal a penthouse that seemed to float among the stars. Floor-to-ceiling windows showcased a breathtaking panorama of Chicago's glittering skyline, a universe of light and power that made her feel smaller and more insignificant than ever before. It was a beautiful, sterile cage, and she was its newest, terrified captive. Her captors pushed her into the center of the vast living space and then retreated, melting into the shadows near the walls like obedient statues. The silence that descended was a physical weight, pressing down on her, magnifying the frantic thrum of her own heart. The room was a monument to cold, minimalist luxury. A black grand piano gleamed in one corner, and a single stark painting hung on a vast white wall. Every surface was polished to a mirror shine, reflecting her own terrified face back at her. She stood frozen, a waitress in a stained uniform, a jarring, fragile imperfection in a world of calculated perfection. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she was waiting for a final judgment. The air in the room changed before she heard a sound. It grew colder, heavier, charged with an authority that was absolute. A man stepped into the room from a darkened hallway, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. He was tall, dressed in a tailored suit so dark it seemed to absorb the light around him. He moved with a lethal, contained grace, his presence so commanding that the other men in the room seemed to shrink, their own brutish physicality rendered clumsy and insignificant. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His power was a palpable force, an invisible tide that pulled all attention, all fear, toward him. He was the still, silent center of the storm that had just torn her life apart. His gaze swept the room once, dismissive of his men, before it landed on her. The eyes that met hers were the color of a winter storm, intelligent and utterly unreadable. They held no heat, no malice, only a profound, assessing stillness. It was a look that stripped away everything but the truth. He saw her rumpled uniform, the terror trembling in her posture, the defiant spark of life she refused to extinguish in her eyes. Ilara felt as if her entire history, her father's illness, the crushing debt, her quiet acts of integrity, was laid bare before him. In that single, protracted moment, she was more seen than she had ever been in her life, and it was the most terrifying feeling of all. A subtle shift occurred in his expression, a tightening around his eyes that was almost imperceptible. It was not anger, but a deep, cold disappointment. He had been presented with a problem, an imperfection in his meticulously controlled world. and her existence was the evidence of it. He took a single, deliberate step forward, and the movement was filled with a predator's economy. His focus never left her face, and in his gaze, she saw a flicker of something she couldn't name. A weariness, perhaps, or the ghost of a wound that matched the one he was about to inflict upon the men who had failed him. He was a king surveying a flaw in his kingdom, and she was the living symbol of that mistake. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, quiet rumble that carried more menace than any shout ever could. "This isn't her!" The words were directed at his subordinates, but they landed on Alara like stones, each one a confirmation of the senseless error that had brought her here. There was no relief in them, only a deeper dread. The finality in his tone was absolute, a judge's verdict delivered without emotion. The men who had brought her stiffened, their fear now a pungent scent in the air. For them, it was a death sentence. For Alara, it was merely the beginning of a different kind of end, delivered by a man who wielded lives as carelessly as a king moves pawns. With a flick of his wrist, a gesture so small it was almost an afterthought, he dismissed them. They didn't speak or make excuses. They simply vanished from the room, their retreat as silent and swift as their arrival. The sudden emptiness was deafening. She was alone with him. The dynamic of her terror shifted instantly. The raw, physical threat of multiple captors was gone, replaced by the infinitely more potent and concentrated pressure of this one man's presence. The vast penthouse suddenly felt claustrophobic, the air thick with unspoken questions, and the chilling certainty that her fate rested entirely in the hands of the silent, imposing figure before her. He began to walk toward her, his polished shoes making no sound on the gleaming marble floor. The distance between them shrank with an agonizing slowness, each step a deliberate beat in a funereal rhythm. He smelled of expensive wool, cold night air, and something else, something metallic and clean like rain on steel. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that she could see the fine silver threads at his temples, the faint, old scar that traced a line just above his left eyebrow. His gaze was different now, the assessment replaced by a raw, unsettling curiosity. He was no longer looking at a mistake. He was looking at her. He saw the unbroken thing inside her, the quiet dignity that she held onto like a shield. He spoke again, his voice softer this time, a conspiratorial whisper that drew her further into his orbit. "They brought the wrong girl," he murmured, his eyes holding hers, a strange, almost regretful acknowledgement passing between them. He held the silence for a long moment, a space where all the horrors of her night and all the violence of his life seemed to converge. Then, a final, quiet declaration sealed her fate, his words less a threat than a statement of irrefutable fact. "But now, you're mine." It was a claim, a pronouncement of ownership that bypassed her will entirely, binding her to him with an invisible, unbreakable chain. He turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the center of the opulent room, his words echoing in the vast, empty space. The silence that rushed back in was no longer neutral. It was his. The air she breathed felt like it belonged to him. The glittering city lights beyond the glass, once a symbol of a distant, unattainable dream, now looked like the bars of a celestial prison he had just locked her inside. Her old life, with its simple struggles and quiet dignity, had been extinguished in that dark alley. A new one had just begun, not with a scream, but with a whisper, and she knew with a soul-deep certainty that she would never again be free of the man who had just claimed her as his own. The memory of his gaze, a chilling mixture of ice and insight, burned itself into her mind, a permanent mark left on her soul. She stood trembling, not from the cold of the room, but from the dawning realization that the greatest danger she faced was not the violence of his world, but the terrifying magnetic pull of the man who ruled it. If you feel the chill of this moment, the weight of his words, then like this video and share it with someone who appreciates a story that grabs you by the heart. Comment below with what you think will happen next, as Alara's journey into the heart of darkness has only just begun. Her return to the world was a jarring dissonance, a film reel playing on the wrong speed. She was physically free, yet his final words echoed in the hollow spaces of her mind. "You're mine." The alley behind La Steadoro was no longer a quiet refuge, but the scene of a life-altering crime. She went through the motions of her shift, her hands steady as she poured wine, but her soul was trembling. A few days later, a letter arrived. It was not from the bank, but from a law firm she'd never heard of. informing her that the entirety of her family's outstanding medical debt had been settled by an anonymous benefactor. There was no relief, only a cold, creeping dread. The invisible chains of debt had been replaced by a silken, suffocating leash, held by a man in the shadows. He did not summon her again. Instead, he simply appeared. One evening, as the restaurant hummed with the low murmur of the city's elite, he was shown to a secluded corner booth. He came alone, a solitary, imposing figure in a world he so clearly commanded. The air in the dining room grew thick with a collective, unspoken tension. Mr. Sterling scurried about with a new, nervous energy, the staff moving with a fearful precision. Damien did not look at the menu. He did not seem to notice the fawning attention of the manager. His gaze, cool and appraising, swept the room once before it found her and stayed. He wasn't a patron. He was a king surveying his newest, most fragile acquisition. Ilara's training took over, her body moving with an autopilot grace she no longer felt. She served other tables, her back always to him, intensely aware of his eyes on her every move. It was not a lecherous gaze, but something far more unnerving. It was possessive, analytical, as if he were memorizing the way she held a tray, the slight tilt of her head as she listened to an order. The entire, opulent room, with its crystal chandeliers and velvet chairs, seemed to shrink until it contained only the two of them, locked in a silent, invisible duel. She could feel the heat of his attention like a brand on her skin, a constant, terrifying reminder that her life was no longer her own to live. She fought the urge to look back, to meet that unnerving stare. To do so would be an acknowledgement, a concession of power she was not willing to make. Her fear was a living thing, a cold knot in her stomach, but beneath it, something else was stirring, a defiant, dangerous curiosity. Who was this man who could erase a lifetime of debt with a simple gesture and command a room with his mere presence? She saw the profound loneliness in his solitude, the way he held his glass without drinking, his stillness a mask for a storm she could only guess at. He was a monster, she told herself, a creature of violence and shadows. But he was also just a man, sitting alone in a crowded room, watching her. The collision was inevitable. As she navigated a narrow path between tables, a flustered busboy, intimidated by the atmosphere, stumbled into her. The tray she was carrying, laden with delicate champagne flutes, tilted precariously. Time seemed to slow as she braced for the crash, the sound of shattering glass, and the subsequent wrath of Mr. Sterling. But it never came. A hand, swift and sure, shot out from the corner booth, not touching her, but catching the edge of the silver tray with impossible speed. Her fingers brushed against his, a fleeting contact of cold skin against warm. The shock was electric, a jolt that went straight to her core, leaving her breathless. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. His storm-gray eyes locked with hers over the rescued glasses, and in their depths, she saw not a predator, but something raw and unguarded. It was a flicker of surprise, a hint of vulnerability that vanished as quickly as it appeared. He retracted his hand, his expression once again an unreadable mask of control. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a dismissal, and an acknowledgement all in one. The busboy stammered an apology and fled. Ilara, her heart hammering against her ribs, simply nodded back, unable to find her voice. She walked away, the phantom sensation of his touch burning on her skin. His presence became a recurring theme in the new, unsettling rhythm of her life. He never came to the restaurant again, but she would feel his watchfulness in other ways. She would see a black sedan, identical to the one that had taken her, parked down the street from her apartment building late at night, its engine a low, idling hum in the quiet darkness. It would be gone by morning. Once, while waiting for the bus in the pouring rain, the same car pulled up to the curb. The back window lowered just enough for her to see his silhouette inside before it sped away, leaving her standing under the flimsy shelter, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and a strange, unwelcome sense of being protected. She existed in a state of suspended animation, trapped between her old life and the new reality he was forging around her. The oppression at work changed its face. Mr. Sterling, who once thrived on her humiliation, now avoided her gaze, treating her with a skittish, fearful deference that was almost as unnerving as his previous cruelty. Small kindnesses began to appear in her life, an anonymous gift certificate for groceries, a new, warmer coat left in her locker. She knew the source. Each gesture was a golden thread in the beautiful, terrifying cage he was building around her, each one a reminder of his silent, pervasive control. She was being cared for by her captor. This calculated generosity was a more insidious form of imprisonment. To accept it felt like a betrayal of her own moral code, a surrender to a world she despised. Yet, to refuse it was impossible. How could she reject the warmth of a coat when the Chicago wind cut through her old one like a knife? How could she turn away the food that would feed her mother? He was not asking for her gratitude. He was simply claiming his territory, marking every aspect of her existence as his. She felt herself being slowly corrupted, not by violence, but by a chilling, inescapable form of care that blurred the lines between right and wrong, between savior and monster. She began to see him not just as a figure of fear, but as a man defined by a profound, almost tragic sense of control. He managed his empire, his men, and now her life with the same meticulous, detached precision. It was as if he believed that by ordering the world around him, he could silence the chaos within. She started to wonder about the scar above his eye, about the source of the deep, abiding sorrow she sometimes saw in his gaze when he thought no one was looking. Her fear of him did not lessen, but it was now complicated by an unwelcome, dangerous flicker of empathy. She was beginning to see the prisoner inside the king. He, in turn, was being undone by her. Damien Falcone, a man who had built an empire on predicting and exploiting human weakness, found himself utterly disarmed by her simple, unwavering strength. He watched her from afar, saw her quiet dignity in the face of her manager's former abuse, her gentle patience with her ailing mother, her refusal to be broken by the world. She was a mirror reflecting a part of himself he thought had died long ago, a conscience, a capacity for empathy. Her very existence was a quiet accusation against the man he had become, and the pull toward her light was as terrifying as it was irresistible. He was a man who traded in secrets and violence, yet he found himself obsessed with the transparent honesty of her life. He had his men investigate her past, not to find leverage, but to understand the source of her resilience. He learned about her father, the crushing debt, the abandoned dreams of being an architect. Each detail was a piece of a puzzle that fascinated and condemned him. She had faced her own darkness and had chosen not to become it. This quiet courage was a quality he had never encountered in his world of brutal survival, and it called to something dormant and damaged deep within his soul. The tension between them was a taut wire, humming with unspoken things. It was in the space between them and the restaurant, in the silence of his car idling on her street, in the weight of his gaze that she felt even when he wasn't there. It was a connection forged not in words, but in shared solitude and a mutual recognition of the cages that defined their lives. Hers of poverty, his of power. She was the one thing in his world he could not control with fear or money, and he was the one thing in hers that offered both damnation and a strange, terrifying form of salvation. He knew he should stay away. She was a complication he could not afford, a light that threatened to expose the darkness he had so carefully cultivated. Protecting her meant bringing her deeper into a world that would inevitably destroy her innocence. Yet the thought of leaving her to the casual cruelties of her life, to the predatory gaze of men like her manager, was now unthinkable. He had inadvertently made her his responsibility, and the instinct to shield her, to preserve that unbroken spirit, was becoming more powerful than his own rigid code of detachment. The delicate balance shattered one night after closing. Ilara was in the back, changing out of her uniform, when Mr. Sterling cornered her in the narrow hallway leading to the alley. He smelled of whiskey and resentment. "Think you're special now, don't you?" he sneered, his fear momentarily eclipsed by drunken bravado. "Think he's going to protect you forever?" He grabbed her arm, his grip tight and bruising. "He'll get bored. They all do. But I'll still be here." Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She opened her mouth to scream, but the sound caught in her throat. Suddenly, the heavy kitchen door swung open with a silent, lethal grace. Damien stood there, a figure carved from shadow and stillness. He wasn't wearing his usual impeccable suit, but a simple, dark sweater, as if he had come from a place of rest, a place he had abandoned for her. He didn't speak. He didn't move. His entire being was focused on a single point. Mr. Sterling's hand clamped around Ilara's arm. The temperature in the hallway plummeted. The drunken confidence drained from the manager's face, replaced by a primal, abject terror. He looked as if he had just seen his own ghost. Damien took one slow, deliberate step forward. The sound of his leather shoes on the tiled floor was the only sound in the suffocating silence. each footfall a hammer blow of judgment. His eyes, colder and harder than she had ever seen them, never left Sterling's hand. They held a promise of such absolute, methodical violence that Alara felt a tremor of fear run through the man holding her. In that moment, Damien was not a man. He was an elemental force of retribution. He was breaking his own rule of staying in the shadows, stepping into the light of her world to answer a threat, and she knew, with chilling certainty, that this was only the beginning. With a fluid, terrifying economy of motion, Damien closed the distance. It was not a rush of anger, but a predator's lethal ballet, each step measured and final. He ignored Alara completely, his entire being focused on the man who dared to touch what he had claimed. Mr. Sterling's hand, still gripping her arm, began to tremble violently. He tried to let go, but his muscles were frozen by a fear so profound it had become a physical paralysis. Damien didn't need to utter a threat. His presence was a promise of a pain so absolute it would rewrite the man's soul. The air grew thin and cold, charged with a stillness that was the precursor to annihilation, and Alara could only watch, a helpless witness to the storm she had inadvertently summoned. Damien's hand moved with a blur of speed, not to strike but to enclose Sterling's wrist. His grip was not one of brute force but of anatomical precision, his fingers finding nerves and pressure points with the expertise of a surgeon. A low, guttural sound of agony escaped Sterling's lips as his own fingers went limp, releasing Alara's arm as if it were white-hot iron. Damien's eyes were chips of ice, holding the manager's terrified gaze, and he leaned in, his voice a barely audible whisper that was more chilling than any shout. "You will never look at her again. You will never speak her name. You will forget she exists. Do you understand?" It was not a question. It was the etching of a new reality onto a broken man's mind. But then, something inside Alara broke through the ice of her own fear. It was the same instinct that made her clean a busboy's mess, the same quiet integrity that was her only true possession. She saw the abject, soul-stripping terror on Sterling's face, a man being dismantled piece by piece, and her own moral code screamed in protest. "Stop," she heard herself say, her voice a fragile thread in the suffocating tension, but it cut through the silence like a shard of glass. "Please, let him go." It was an insane act of transgression. She was defending her tormentor from her protector, choosing mercy in a place where it had no currency, and in doing so, she defied the brutal logic of Damien's world. Damien froze. Her words struck him with a physical force, a blow more staggering than any his enemies had ever landed. He turned his head slowly, his gaze shifting from the pathetic, whimpering man in his grasp to her. For the first time since she had met him, the mask of cold control shattered. He looked at her with a raw, naked confusion, as if she had just spoken a language from a forgotten, gentler world. He had expected tears, gratitude, or terrified silence. He had not expected this, an impossible, defiant act of grace. He saw her not as a victim to be saved, but as a force of nature he could not comprehend, a light so bright it exposed the depths of his own darkness. In that eternal moment, a war was waged behind his eyes. Every instinct, every lesson learned in a life of violence and retribution, screamed at him to finish what he had started, to make an example of this man, to reinforce the fear that was the very foundation of his power. But her voice, her plea, echoed louder. It was a sound of a world he thought was lost to him forever, a world where forgiveness was possible, where human life, even one as wretched as Sterling's, had value. To honor her request was to break the most fundamental rule of his existence. To show weakness, to show mercy, he made his choice. With a final, contemptuous look, Damien released his grip. The sudden absence of pressure was as shocking as its application. Mr. Sterling stumbled backward, clutching his wrist, his face a mask of disbelief and terror. He didn't wait for a second dismissal. He scrambled away, his feet slipping on the tiled floor as he fled back into the kitchen, the sound of his panicked retreat echoing in the now cavernous silence of the hallway. He was gone, a ghost exorcised by a quiet word and a chilling touch. And then there were only two. The air remained thick with the aftermath of violence, the ghost of what could have been, and the deafening sound of their two hearts beating in the sudden, profound stillness. The tension, having nowhere left to go, seemed to collapse inward. Damien did not look at her. Instead, he took a step back, and leaned his shoulders against the cold brick wall, the movement uncharacteristically weary. He closed his eyes for a single, protracted moment, and in that brief surrender, Ilara saw not the Mafia Boss, not the monster, but a man staggering under an invisible, crushing weight. The breath he let out was not a sigh of relief, but of profound exhaustion, as if the single act of mercy had cost him more strength than a lifetime of violence. He had transgressed against himself for her, and the cost of it was etched on his face. She looked at her own arm, at the red mark Sterling's fingers had left behind, and then she looked at him. The fear was still there, a low, persistent hum, but it was now interwoven with something else, something deeper and far more dangerous: understanding. She had seen the absolute, terrifying lethality he was capable of, and she had seen him rein it in at her request. She saw the profound loneliness of his power and the prison he had built for himself out of control and fear. He wasn't just the man who had claimed her. He was a man trapped in a battle with the monster inside him, and tonight, for her, he had let the man win. He finally opened his eyes and looked at her, and his gaze was stripped of all its armor. There was no possessiveness, no cold authority. There was only a raw, unguarded vulnerability, a silent acknowledgement of the truth that now lay bare between them. He had seen the core of her, her unwavering moral light, and she had seen the core of him, the fractured, violent heart that still, impossibly, knew how to bend. In that shared look, the dynamic between them was irrevocably rewritten. She was no longer just his captive, and he was no longer just her captor. They were two souls who had seen the other's truth in a moment of brutal clarity. He pushed himself off the wall, his movements once again controlled, but the weariness lingered in his eyes. The space between them felt both sacred and perilous, a fragile, impossible bridge built over an abyss. He needed to re-establish the distance, to push her back to safety, away from the contamination of his world, and, more importantly, away from the man he was. He knew that what had happened here had bound them together in a way that was far more permanent than his initial claim. He took a breath, the first word of a new, terrifying chapter on his lips. "Go home, Ilara," he said, his voice low and rough, an order that sounded heartbreakingly like a plea. She walked home through the empty, pre-dawn streets, his words a ghost in her ears. The city, usually a symphony of noise and life, was muted, as if holding its breath in the wake of the confrontation. Each step she took away from the alley felt like stretching a delicate, invisible thread to its breaking point. The cold air was no longer just a physical sensation. It was the chill of the abyss she had just looked into, the profound, terrifying emptiness of his world. She didn't feel saved. She felt marked, irrevocably altered by the violence he had contained on her behalf. The quiet integrity she had guarded so fiercely now felt fragile, tainted by a debt that could never be repaid with money. She had commanded a monster, and the silence he left behind was his most terrifying power yet. The next day, Mr. Sterling was gone. He didn't call in sick, he didn't formally quit. His presence was simply erased from La Stella d'Oro, as cleanly as a stain scrubbed from marble. The staff moved with a hushed, nervous energy, their eyes darting toward Ilara with a mixture of fear and awe, then quickly looking away. No one asked any questions. His absence was a silent, screaming testament to Damien's reach, a casual display of power that was more intimidating than any open threat. The restaurant, once a cage of simple, mundane oppression, had transformed. It was now haunted ground, a place where a far more dangerous predator had left his scent, and Ilara knew that every person who looked at her now saw not a waitress, but the property of a king. In his penthouse, surrounded by glass and sky, Damien stood in a silence of his own making. He watched the rain begin to fall, tracing silver lines down the vast windows that separated him from the city below. Her plea, "Stop," echoed in the sterile quiet of the room, a sound so out of place it felt like a sacrilege. It had been an act of impossible grace, a moral defiance he hadn't known still existed. He had built his empire on the predictable foundations of greed and fear, but she was an architecture he could not comprehend. To keep her safe, to preserve that light, he knew he had to become a ghost in her life. He had to sever the very connection that was beginning to feel like the only real thing in his world. It was the cruelest logic. To protect her from the monster, he had to starve the man. The black sedan no longer idled on her street. The anonymous gifts ceased. The oppressive, watchful silence she had grown accustomed to was replaced by a different kind, a hollow, aching void. Days bled into a week, and she found herself listening for a sound that never came, her eyes scanning the street for a shadow that was no longer there. His absence was a physical presence, a constant low-grade fever in her soul. She would stand by her window, watching the rain fall, feeling an inexplicable kinship with the man in the glass tower. She understood now that his protection was a cage, but its absence felt like a far more profound and desolate form of abandonment. She had been returned to her life, but she no longer fit inside it. The whispers in the underworld were not so silent. Damien Falcone, a man known for his surgical detachment, had personally intervened for a waitress. It was a crack in his armor of impenetrable control, a hint of a vulnerability his rivals had never suspected. The consequence for his act of mercy was a renewed threat to his throne. He was forced to retreat deeper into the persona he had crafted, becoming colder, more ruthless, to cauterize the perceived weakness. He made examples of men for lesser infractions, his violence a brutal, calculated message to the world. Each act was a stone added to the wall he was rebuilding around himself, a wall designed not only to keep his enemies out, but to keep the memory of her defiant compassion from ever reaching him again. Her life, stripped of his influence, should have felt lighter. The debt was gone, her tormentor had vanished. Yet, the freedom was a phantom limb, an ache where something vital used to be. The pain of her old struggles had been a simple, straightforward thing. This new pain was complex, a tangled knot of gratitude, fear, and a longing she refused to name. This was the beginning of her lucidity. She finally understood the true price of his intervention, a piece of her own moral certainty. She had been saved by a man who dealt in death, and her plea for mercy had, in its own way, implicated her in his world. She was no longer just an innocent victim. She was a woman who had seen the darkness and, for a moment, held its leash. She stopped wearing the new coat he had given her, leaving it in the back of her closet. But she couldn't bring herself to throw it away. Sometimes, in the dead of night, she would take it out, the fine cashmere still holding a faint, clean scent of cold air in him. It was a tangible link to an impossible moment, a symbol of the beautiful, terrifying cage he had built for her. Running her fingers over the soft fabric, she would remember the brief, shocking warmth of his hand against hers as he saved the falling tray. It was a memory of a connection forged in silence and proximity, a shared solitude that felt more intimate than any conversation. The coat was a relic of a life that was never truly hers, a life she now mourned with a quiet, secret grief. Damien sat at the head of a long, polished table, his capos delivering their reports in low, deferential tones. He issued orders with a chilling finality, his face an unreadable mask of stone. He was the king, fully restored, his control absolute. But as one of his men detailed a particularly brutal reprisal, Damien's gaze drifted to the window, to the distant, indifferent lights of the city. For a fraction of a second, the mask slipped. He wasn't seeing the skyline, he was seeing a narrow hallway, a girl with terror and defiance in her eyes, and the ghost of a man he might have been. He had won. He had secured his power and pushed her back to safety. But the victory tasted like ash in his mouth. The silence in his penthouse, a monument to his profound and utter solitude. 1 week after the incident, Alara walked into La Stella d'Oro, not in her uniform, but in her own simple clothes. She handed her letter of resignation to the new manager, a nervous man who couldn't quite meet her eyes. There were no grand speeches, no final goodbyes. It was a quiet, deliberate act of severing the last physical tie to the place where their worlds had collided. It was not a rejection of Damien, but an affirmation of herself. She could not go back to being the ghost who served the powerful. She had to find a way to build a life on her own terms, even if it meant starting again from nothing. Walking out of the ornate doors for the last time, she felt not relief, but the quiet, solemn weight of her own freedom. That night, in 2 separate parts of the city, they both stood at their windows, looking out at the same blanket of stars spread over the Chicago skyline. He, in his tower of glass and power, a prisoner of his own making. She, in her small, humble apartment, a free woman haunted by the shadow of her gilded cage. The distance between them was absolute, a chasm of morality, violence, and circumstance. Yet, the silence that connected them was just as real, a low, resonant hum of unspoken things, of a shared moment when a monster had shown mercy, and an ordinary woman had shown impossible courage. The story was not over, it was simply holding its breath. Months bled into a year, a quiet passage of time that began to heal the sharpest edges of her memory. Elara found her breath again, not in the gilded cage of La Stella d'Oro, but in a small, sunlit architectural firm on the city's north side. The scent of graphite and drafting paper replaced the cloying aroma of expensive perfume, and her hands, once raw from washing dishes, now held the clean, precise tools of creation. She was rebuilding her life from the foundation up, her quiet dignity no longer a shield but a blueprint. The dream she had thought was dead was slowly being sketched back into existence, line by careful line. She was no longer a ghost in someone else's story. She was the architect of her own, finding a fragile, hard-won piece in the quiet order of her new world. The firm, small but ambitious, landed the chance to bid on a career-defining project, a sprawling community arts center in one of Chicago's most neglected neighborhoods. It was a project born of hope, funded by a mysterious, anonymous benefactor known only through a labyrinth of trusts and foundations. For Elara, the work was more than a job. It was a calling. She poured her soul into the designs, imagining spaces filled with light and music, a sanctuary built not of marble and cold glass, but of warmth and possibility. It was everything she believed in, a chance to create something that gave back, to build a future that was not just for the powerful, but for everyone. Her passion and talent shone, and her designs became the heart of the firm's final proposal. On the eve of the proposal submission, her boss, trusting her meticulous nature, asked her to perform a final review of the benefactor's legal dossier. She worked late into the night, the office silent around her, the only sound, the soft rustle of paper. Deep within a dense folio of corporate charters and legal jargon, tucked away in a subclause of a holding company's registration, she saw it. A single familiar name listed as a silent partner, a name that made the air leave her lungs in a sudden, sharp gasp. Falcone. It wasn't his first name, just the family name, a ghost signature from a world she had tried to forget. The anonymous philanthropist was him. The foundation of hope she was building on was his. The realization was not a shock of fear, but a slow, profound wave of understanding that washed over her, clearing away the last vestiges of her resentment. He hadn't just erased her past debt. He'd invested in her future. He had seen the dream she kept hidden in her heart, the one about building beautiful things, and had quietly, from the deepest shadows, cleared the ground for her to begin. It was not an act of possession, but of liberation, the most profound and selfless gesture she could imagine. He was using his dark power not to control, but to create. It was his silent apology, his act of penance, a bridge built between his world of destruction and her world of creation. That night she was drawn not to her apartment but to the future site of the art center. It was a vast, empty lot under a sky full of cold, distant stars. As she stood at the edge of the broken pavement, a familiar black sedan pulled to a silent stop at the far end of the street. Its headlights cut two long, lonely paths through the darkness, but they did not touch her. She couldn't see his face through the tinted glass, but she felt his gaze as surely as she felt the cool night air on her skin. He didn't move, and she didn't run. They remained there for a long, timeless moment, two solitary figures separated by an expanse of darkness and rubble, sharing a silent acknowledgement of the beautiful, impossible thing they were building together, yet apart. The car finally pulled away, its taillights disappearing into the city's glow, leaving her alone with the quiet promise of the future. She was free, but she was not, and would never be, alone. He had not stepped into her light, but had chosen to guard it from the darkness. His redemption was not in changing who he was, but in what he chose to do with his power for her. And in that quiet, empty lot, Elara finally understood that some bonds are forged not in presence, but in the profound, unwavering certainty of a distant watchfulness. If this story of a love forged in shadow and light touched your heart, show your support by liking this video. Share it with someone who believes in second chances, and comment below with a single word that describes their connection. Subscribe to witness more stories where redemption is found in the most unexpected of places. He had given her a world to build, content to remain its silent, unseen guardian.